Hi, greetings and welcome. Now you know the session started because the awesome music has stopped playing, but we are absolutely thrilled to have you here today. I'd like to, we have so many people in the audience. I'd like to hear I'd like to see a what's up, an emoji to show me that you're alive in that chat. Maybe throw something up with, yeah, hands clapping. Tell me what you thought about the music. Let us know if you're from UTEP or EPCC. Um, ask about the Tejano passport code. Thank you for all that. That's awesome. I'm very excited to be introducing this event for today. My name is Crystal Robert. I am with the Pasos program, and we are hosting tonight's event dealing with Bracero history. We're celebrating tonight 80 years of Bracero history with some of the most amazing speakers that our Paso del Norte region has to offer. I'd like to give you a little bit of background information for those of you who don't know about Pasos. Pasos is a program out of the El Paso Community College that brings together motivated educators and a community that view our location, population, and stories as assets to student success. Pasos is dedicated to advancing our U.S.-Mexico border community through family engagement, equity in the classroom, inclusion, and social justice. We will increase civic engagement through educational creative projects, service learning, and community activism. And that's what we have for you today, folks. Absolutely thrilled about our speakers today. I will first begin by introducing I'm sorry. One of my colleagues would like to share some information with you. Our Pasos program is split up into several different subcommittees, if you will. One of those being the College of the Community, which is the program that you're witnessing right now. But all of our events are going to be hosted in our new Pasos program oral history LibGuide. And so I believe Mr. Oscar Baeza would like to share a little bit of information about that before we move forward.
Hello, Crystal. Thank you for that introduction there. Hope everybody can see me. Hello. I'm having some technical difficulties, but I did post the LibGuide on the chat. Please visit our LibGuides, everybody, and get some more information about our current event that we're having today, but also some of our past events that we've already had. There is videos there that you could see, and it's just some really great information that you can learn about some of the oral projects that we have done, that we're planning to do, and that we're doing today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Oscar. So today I have the immense pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Tim Z. Hernandez. Um, Mr. Tim Z. Hernandez, I've been using a lot of his work in my classes, and so I'm absolutely thrilled. I apologize. I might stumble over my words or get a little too excited. I feel like a fangirl right now. It's almost like I'm seeing some folks from, it's almost like I'm seeing my favorite rock star. Um, but I'll introduce Mr. Hernandez. He was born in Dinuba, California, raised in the San Joaquin Valley of Central California, where he lived predominantly in a farm worker community in the agricultural region. Early in his life, his parents were migrant farm workers, and they would follow the seasons in the Southwest. So those familiar with the farm workers know those travels. And during this time on the road, he developed an interest in travel and stories. He earned his BA in writing and literature from the first accredited Buddhist institute in the West, Naropa University. He holds an MFA in writing and literature from Bennington College in Vermont, and he is currently an associate professor at the University of Texas at El Paso's bilingual MFA creative writing program. So that's what he does as an educator. But Tim Z. Hernandez is also a writer, poet, and performer. His poetry collection, Skin Tax, received the 2016 6th American Book Award. His debut novel, Breathing in Dust, was awarded the 2010 Premio Aztlán Literary Prize, and he was a finalist for the California Book Award. In 2011, he was named one of the 16 new American poets by the Poetry Society of America. And in 2014, he received the Colorado Book Award for his poetry collection, Natural Takeover of Small Things, and the 2014 International Latino Book Award for his historical fiction novel, Mañana Means Heaven. In 2018, he received the Luis Leal Award for Distinction in Chicano Letters administered by the UC Santa Barbara. And in 2019, he was inducted to the Texas Institute of Letters. Hernandez's performances have been featured at the Getty Center, Denver Center for the Performing Arts, Dixon Experimental Theater in New York City, the Loft Literary Center, Intersection of the Arts, Stanford University, and the Jack Kerouac School, among other venues. Without further ado, I'm very excited to see him live and in person. I usually just hear him over my radio when he's doing Words on the Wire on our KTEP radio station. So I'm excited to see your face too.
Hi.
Hi. So please take it away, because I have questions. We'll have questions. We'll have questions and answers in a little bit. We'd also like to show your awesome music video with Lance Canales, but I'd also I hope that you would talk to us about that as well.
Sure. Do you want to show that at the end once I'm done, or do you want to show that right now? It's up to you.
No, you tell me. What kind of arrangement do you see? How do you want it to feel right now?
I mean, it's kind of nice to just kick it off with that, a little bit of music, a little bit of sort of a nice energy. Yeah, why not?
I love it in my classroom. Everybody gets real intense. So are you ready? Here comes the intensity.
Okay.
Crops rolling and the peaches are rotting. The oranges are piled, creosote on. They're flying me back, Mexican border. Pay all my money, wait back again. Goodbye to my wine, goodbye Rosalita. Adios mi amigo, si Maria. No, we won't have a name when we ride the big airplane. All they will call us is Dirty 14. My father's own father waded that river. They took all the money he made in his life. My brothers and sisters come work in the fruit tree. They rode the big truck till they took down and died. We died in your hills, we died in your desert. We died in your valleys, we died in your plains. We died in your trees, we died in your bushes. Both sides of the river, we died just the same. Goodbye to my wine, goodbye Rosalita. Adios mi amigos, si Maria. We won't have a name when we ride the big airplane. All they will call us is Dirty 14. Goodbye to my one, goodbye Rosalita. Adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. No, we won't have a name when we ride the big airplane. All they will call us is the T14.
Cedro Medina Lara, José Rodríguez Macías, Luis López Medina, Luis Cuevas Miranda,
Some of us illegal and some are unwanted.
Ignacio Pérez Navarro, Romano Chumacucho,
Said some of us illegal and most are unwanted.
Ramón Ramírez Paredes, Antonio Ramírez Plasencia,
600 miles, Mexican border.
Guadalupe Laura Ramírez, Alberto Carlos
They
Zaragoza,
chase us like outlaws, like animals like these.
Mazadrina de García, Bernabé López García,
Sky plane caught fire over Los Gatos Canyon.
Salvador Sandoval Hernández,
A fireball of lightning that shook all the hill.
Hernández Rodríguez, Reyes Montalvo,
You ask who are these friends, all scattered like dry leaves.
Valenzuela Ruiz, Enciarado Ruiz,
Radio calls us all just deportees. Goodbye to my one, goodbye Rosalita. Adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. No, you won't have a name when we ride the big airplane. All they will call us is 3014. Goodbye to my one, goodbye Rosalita. Adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. No, we won't have a name when we ride the big airplane. All they will call us is 3014. Goodbye to my one, goodbye Rosalita. Adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. No, we won't have a name when we ride the big airplane. All they will call us is 3014.
José Valdivia Sánchez, Jesús Mesa Santos, Baldomero Marcos Torres, presente.
Very nice. Wonderful. That's great. Thank you so much for showing that. Can everybody hear me? I don't know if I'm on there or I can't tell. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, great. And everyone can see me good. Okay. Thank you again so much. Crystal, thank you so much and actually all of the Pasos Oral History Project, the whole team that put this event together, and of course, my colleagues at UTEP, especially those Yolanda, Dr. Leva, who's also in charge of the Oral History Project, and just all the wonderful folks that have been doing this work for a lot longer than I have. I'm really honored. I'm really honored to be invited to this event. You know, it's always an honor to speak about not just Bracero history, but the history of our relatives, of our family, where they've come from, which is really, and their experiences, particularly here in the United States, which is, you know, how I come to this story in a very, very organic way, not as somebody. When I came upon this story, and I'll give you a little context in a second, but when I came upon this story, it was not like a situation where I was out looking for a story. You know, it was really just about me being curious about the place I call home and where I come from, which is the San Joaquin Valley in California. And, you know, as many of us who've done research, you know, if you've done any kind of research, especially historical research, you find very quickly that if you just scratch the surface, you know, history is ready to search forth and to sort of provide answers and to lead you down an incredible journey, to be honest with you. And so that's how I come at this story. You know, as I said, I'm the son, and as Crystal mentioned in my introduction there, I'm the son and grandson of migrant farm workers. My family, I'm actually the fourth generation born here in the United States from my mother's side, and the third generation on my father's side. My grandparents were born in Texas in the Rio Grande Valley here, just south of us here in El Paso. But but being there, raised up in San Joaquin Valley, it's a big agricultural community. Folks often think that to say California we assume automatically the Bay Area or Los Angeles, but we don't often know that 70% of California's economy is in the ag industry, in the agricultural industry, which is the center of California. That's where I'm from. Early in 2010, I was doing research for a whole other book, and I stumbled upon this. I was actually just kind of curious, and I was at the library typing, and I think I was looking through the microfiche, the old newspaper clippings for, I don't remember what exactly, maybe it was I think I was looking for a labor camp in 1948 where a lot of campesinos and migrants were working. And I ended up seeing this article about a plane crash there in the San Joaquin Valley. And the headline said something to the effect of, 100 people see an airplane fall out of the sky, ship plunged to earth. It's a really dramatic headline. And it said farm labor accident. And I was immediately pulled into the story. It was in the town of Coalinga, California, which is just a stone's throw. It's just down the street from where I grew up, basically, a few miles southwest. And there in California. And when I read the article, by the time I was done reading the end of the article, I realized this is the plane crash. I think this is the plane crash that Woody Guthrie wrote this famous song about. And I couldn't believe that it happened right there in my backyard. And so let me tell you a little bit about the story. So the story goes in 1948, January 28th, 1948, 28 Mexicanos were Braceros were being deported by the government, the United States government. They were actually put onto an airplane and sent from Oakland, California. They were corralled in the San Joaquin Valley and in the Bay Area. They were picked up. They were put in an airplane in Oakland, California, and then they were flown to El Centro on the San Diego border, where they were going to be, deported back to Mexico. But an hour into the flight, the plane crashed there in the San Joaquin Valley. It came down and crashed, killed everyone aboard, all 28 Mexican passengers and the 4 American crew members, the pilot, co-pilot, stewardess, and the immigration officer, and killed all 32 people. And the newspapers only mentioned the American crew members by name. Frank Atkinson, age 30, his wife, Bobby Lillian Atkinson, the stewardess, age 29, from Rochester, New York. Frank Chaffin from Berkeley, he's the immigration officer, and co-pilot Marion Ewing from Balboa Park. So they mention them and even give a little bit of a profile of who the American crew members are. But then it says, and 28 Mexican deportees. And that's it. That's all the other 28 Mexicanos got. Not a mention of their names, who they were, where they were from, what they were doing here, nothing. And then to add insult to injury, the 4 American crew members were all their remains were all transported back to as far as Rochester, New York, to their families, where their families were able to have, funeral services and grieve and find closure. But the 28 Mexicanos, this was the part that got me the most, was that their remains were never sent back home. Their remains were actually interred in an unmarked mass grave. It was the largest unmarked mass grave in California's history at that time, in 1948. And their remains were pushed into an unmarked mass grave in Fresno, California, and they were buried over, and like I said, no marker, anything to mention who they were, and that's where they remained for 70 years. Their families, their children, nobody knew what happened to them. Some of them did hear that their father or their relative was killed in a plane crash somewhere in California, but that was it. They didn't receive too much more information. And so, I came upon this newspaper and I recognized right away, this is the incident that Woody Guthrie wrote his famous song about. So what happened was, after the burial of the 28 Mexicanos, the newspapers reported that obviously all across the country, the Associated Press, and it got into the ear or the hands of Woody Guthrie, who was a iconic folk musician in the United States, who popularly wrote "This Land Is Your Land," and he heard it, and he was really big on names, and he was really upset that the Mexicanos didn't receive the dignity of their names. So he wrote, at the time, he wrote a poem. In his poem, he writes, "Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride that big airplane. All they will call you will be deportee." And the poem goes on with a song recorded by Pete Seeger, later Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson. Everybody records that song. And for the last 60 years, 60, almost 70 years now, that song has existed. That message has existed, in the atmosphere. I like to think it went around the world. And in the lyrics actually say, Woody Guthrie actually writes in the lyrics, "Who are these friends all scattered like dry leaves? The radio says they're just deportees." I like to imagine that for 60 something years, that refrain, that question, "Who are these friends? Who are these friends?" echoed across, the atmospheres around the world and just hung in the air long enough for someone who was the son and grandson of migrant farm workers, who could empathize with the story, who was from that same terrain where this plane crash happened and decided to become a writer and become an author. And, um, was it Zora Neale Hurston who said some years are for asking questions and other years are for answering them? And I feel like it hung in the air for that question hung in the air for six decades until someone came along, myself, to answer those questions. Who are they? That's what's led my research since 2010. So almost 13 years now, I've been searching for the families of the victims of the plane crash at Los Gatos. But let me take you back a little bit, because what you saw was Lance Canales, my good friend, who's actually from my hometown there in the San Joaquin Valley. And crazy enough, turns out we might even be cousins. His family's from South Texas also. But Lance and I, we got together and we recorded that song with the names. And it had never been recorded with the names before until I found the names. And we recorded it as a way to help raise money, originally as a way to help raise money to install a headstone over the gravesite with the names of everybody and the story of what happened. And Lance and I got together in 2012 for the first time. We did a performance at the Steinbeck Center in California, in Salinas. And we read the names out loud and we told the story, and Lance, played the song, and I read the names with the people and all that. And that song went on to sell quite a bit of copies. And then, we ended up, with the help from around the world, raising $14,000, and we installed a new headstone there in 2013. That's the image that you see in Lance's video, is the headstone there. That's what we, with the help of, like I said, people around the world and donations, we got to install the headstone now that memorializes the folks there. But on that day in 2013, I'm going to actually stop here in a little bit and take questions. Okay, so if you have any questions, prepare them for me, please. But on that day in 2013, on Labor Day, when we installed that headstone before a crowd of 1,000 people, I felt personally like my work had just begun, because the headstone is great. Obviously, it's an important marker, a show of sign of respect and dignity for those who came here and made the greatest sacrifice of their lives, working on behalf of America during the war efforts in World War II in the 1940s. And so that was a very proud and important moment. However, I felt like it was still very much a symbol. It was symbolic. The headstone was symbolic. For me, as an author and an oral historian, even, I felt like the next step was to find out who they are. What are the stories behind the people's names? As I looked down on that day at the memorial headstone and I saw all their names, to me, I felt like there are 32 names here, but that means that there are 32 stories that need to be gathered. How do I begin? And so I've pretty much committed my life since then, since 2010, to finding who they are. And to date, I've actually located, in the last, like I said, almost 13 years, located 13 families, gone all around central Mexico, knocking on doors, in many instances, very coldly knocking on doors because there was no previous contact, with the little bits of clues here and there that I was finding and piecing together. I wrote a lot about that. I chronicled a lot of that journey in my book, All They Will Call You, which was published in 2017. And at the time the book was published, I had only found 7 families. Since the book was published, since then, more families, because of the book and because of media that's talked about the book and my research, ended up, more families started to find me. So it's kind of worked a little bit. Art has gravity. You put art, especially books, music, out into the world, there's a gravity. It pulls people and communities toward it as well. I believe that. So the book did pull more families toward me, and I've since found 6 more families. And believe it or not, I'm working now on a second part of this book. I won't tell you I won't tell you too much about it, but yeah, there's a second book coming out, and I'm almost just about done working on that now, finishing that and telling you more of the stories and more of the journey. So yeah, that's kind of been that's been the journey. Like I said, I think the greatest part for me, I actually want to share just an excerpt of the book because I want to share with you what informs the way I gather these stories. Because for me, whenever you're gathering oral history, um, there are often contradictory anecdotes, contradictory accounts. People will say one thing and another will contradict that. And for me, accuracy, quote unquote accuracy, was never the goal. Well, I'll just read it because I wrote about it. So let me just read that too. It's a small, it's a paragraph. Bear with me here. It is in the spirit that the telling of the plain wreck at Los Gatos and how the song of the same name has been uncovered after nearly 7 decades. While the telling itself is true, its loyalty is not to people of fact, but to people of memory, which is to say all of us. In this way, it's inevitable that some rememberings will contradict other rememberings. If several people witness the same tragedy and offer different accounts, whose version is the most accurate? In this case, perception is truth. And how reliable is fact anyway when quote unquote official documents themselves have been proven incorrect, beginning with the names of the passengers? Officialness also has inconsistencies. To stumble upon a plane crash is to stumble upon the fragmented shards of stories and to have faith that from these clues our own glaring humanity offers enough light to fill in the unknown. The facts of what occurred on that day are not, nor have they ever been, the purpose of this book. This telling is not interested in the calculable details, but instead the testimonies themselves from people whose lives were touched in incalculable ways. How a tragedy and a song had a lasting effect on people, on those who lived it. And though memory's propeller turns with embellishment, guesswork, and even reimagining, this telling is rooted in years of investigation and interviews with the surviving family and friends I was successful in locating. It was a search that has required traveling 6 decades back in time, numerous cities, ranchos, and barrios in 3 nations, 3 languages, with limited resources and only a single shred of newspaper as the clue. In the end, of the 32 passengers reported to be on that plane, I managed to locate the families of 7. But as you'll find, the total number of lives changed on that cold winter morning of January 28, 1948, was far greater. Thank you. And, I'll open it up to some questions if anyone has questions about this search or this journey or the book or any part of the process. Might open. I don't know how we can moderate these questions, or if we don't come in here, I can also.
We can have people raise their hand or post in the chat, and I'll read it out loud to you if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is there anyone with questions? Because I have lots of questions, but I don't want to take up all the time. Okay, first, what does the Z stand for? I couldn't find that anywhere.
That's funny. I get that a lot. It's actually my mother's maiden name, Zúñiga.
Oh, okay.
Zúñiga, yeah.
I was thinking Zeta, like, is it Carlos Zeta Costa? I was like, that would
be... Yeah, Oscar Zeta Costa, yeah, absolutely. Who's also,
oh, I'm sorry.
An influence of my own writing early on, who was originally from El Paso, right? So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all my favorite heroes had Z's, so.
Very cool. So Oscar said that. Sorry, thank you for correcting me. Okay, Bianca Flores is asking not a question, but she would like to say that you're an amazing writer and truly touching. Hey,
thank you. I appreciate it.
That's the first thing I want to know. Where can we buy your book?
You can purchase it locally in El Paso. You can purchase it at Literarity Bookstore. They have it here in El Paso. They usually keep a bunch of copies on hand, but you can also purchase it from your local bookstore wherever you're at. They can order a copy for you. Yeah, or you can purchase it online as well.
Okay, great. Yeah. So Literarity Bookstore. When we have a moment, we'll go ahead and we'll post it in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Leva has a question for you.
Wonderful.
She asks. Go ahead. Can you see it?
He asks how I started finding the families. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Leva. I appreciate you so much, and I'm honored to be on this discussion with you as well, this event. Yeah, how I began finding the families. it's funny, right? Because I spent the first 2 years from 2010 to 2012 not knowing how to begin. I just kind of was very naively knocking on doors, going up into Los Gatos Canyon, knocking on doors. You know, I had no way of trying to find them. I went online and looked through some of the online resources, you know, genealogical websites, National Archives.gov, places like that, and I couldn't find any information on any of the families that way. I kind of threw up my hands in early 2013. I threw up my hands and was like, I don't know what else to do, except I had one more move, which I didn't want to do. I was trying to not make this move, but I had to, and that was to appeal to the media. So I went to a friend of mine, his name, who's actually an El Pasoan as well, originally, Juan Esparza, who's a journalist in the San Joaquin Valley, a reporter, and in fact, one of the founders of Vida en el Valle. It's the only bilingual newspaper between Sacramento and Bakersfield, California. And it's a bilingual newspaper that comes out once a week. And I went to him, he's a friend of mine, and I said, Juan, here's a story, looking for the families. I know it's a long shot, but would you run it? And he said, yeah, I'll do it. So he printed that story out. And like I said, that paper comes out once a week. And what happened was 3 weeks later, so 3 cycles, 3 newspapers later, 3 weeks later, I didn't hear anything until 3 weeks later, I got an email from Mr. Jaime Ramirez. And the email is lovely. It said, you know, I saw your article in the newspaper, and I want you to know that that my tío, my grandfather, and my uncle were killed in that plane crash. And if you need to know anything, let me know. And I thought, wow. So I called him up right away. I called him up, and he said, I'm here in Fresno. And I said, are you kidding me? Of all the places that you could have been, you're in Fresno, where, you know, the area where I'm from. So I met with him, and I mean, just how synchronous it was that he would be the first family I would find. Because when I met with him, he said, after about 2 hours of talking, I was getting ready to leave, and he said, do you have a list of the names of all the passengers? Now, this is before there was a headstone, before I had any names, right? This is like early 2013. I didn't have the names of people yet. I had a list, but it was from the official Hall of Records, and the list was obviously very erroneous. There were a lot of names that you can tell were not even, you know, real names. And they were spelled probably phonetically by whoever the person was registering them, the Braceros were, whoever that person was. And so he said to me, do you have a list of names? I said, I don't really have a list. I have this list, but I don't trust it. It seems very erroneous. And he said, because I have a list too. And I said, you do? I'd love to see it. And he pulls out this old newspaper from 1948, and he laid it down, this ratty old sort of, you know, sepia stained newspaper. And it was in Spanish, and I said, wow. And he says, here, this newspaper shows the names of everybody. But not only did it have the first, middle, and last name of every passenger, it also said where in Mexico they were from, the town or the community in Mexico they were from. And then it went on to say, here's their address. And then it said, here's their family members' names, their surviving family members. That's the list that I kept. Well, I said to him, well, you know, can I get a copy of that? And he said, I've been saving it all these years for you. And he passed it on to me. And with that, you know, I've kept that paper, and it's really become the one clue that has helped me find more and more families. That's how it all began, was finding the Ramirez family. Yeah.
That's a phenomenal story, and I have to tell you once again, like, it's the second time I've gotten chills. Just wonderful storytelling. Thank you. Alejandra wants to know how many families after publishing the book have come in contact with you.
Yeah, like I said, a total of 13 families so far that I've confirmed. And I say that because, you know, when there's a 14th family, but some families, you know, are skeptical, or some families take a little more time to work with, you know, for whatever the reasons are. So it's always a matter of confirming they are who they say they are. I know, and it sounds kind of funny, because from the family's perspective, they're like, well, we know who we are. Who are you to ask us who we are? Who are you to question? But to formally be able to include them in this research as a part of this project, as a part of my books, I have to do that work of confirming they are who they say they are. And, you know, some families are really readily just ready to work with me on that. Other families take a little more time, and probably, you know, a little less than trusting, which, you know, it makes sense. They don't know who I am. But what I always try and do when I come upon a new family, and they feel like that, one of the first things I do is I give them the phone numbers of all the other 12 families I've worked with now over 10 years, you know, some of these families. So I give them the numbers to contact them, they've been working with me now for years, you know, have a conversation with them about who I am and what I'm doing. And that usually eases everybody up. But 13 families, yeah.
That's wonderful. I've been, since we're talking about the families, do you mind if I ask, were any of the families in the video? Because that's something that I always
Yes.
wonder.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. The Ramirez family, I think they're holding a sign that has of their own relatives. I think it says Guadalupe Ramirez Lara,
Uh-huh.
and that's the sign says that. And then Ramon Paredes Gonzalez, those are the relatives, the grandfather and tío. And the ones holding the sign up I saw is my friend, my brother Jaime Ramirez and his wife Lilia. They're holding the sign up, and they're standing in front of their restaurant holding up the sign of their own relatives. That's very powerful. Yeah, gives
Incredibly
me
so.
chills
Yeah.
every time I see it, I go, wow, it's incredible.
That's something I always try to impart to my students, and I say, look at these faces. How many of them do you think could have been one of those faces? How many of them do you think were related? Elizabeth is asking why the bodies of the Mexican workers were not sent back to their home.
Well, that's a great question, Elizabeth. I've asked that many, many times to different entities and have never gotten a response. I spoke with actually the Mexican consulate in Fresno, California, who they were the consulate that was in charge of part of that investigation after the crash. Obviously, the consulado, the consulate who's in place when I interviewed them, it's not the same person. He wasn't even born, in fact, when that accident happened. But his response when I asked, "Why do you think?" What was the reason you think from the consulado's perspective, what's the reason you think they may not have? And he said at the time, we probably couldn't tell whose body was whose. Who would we send home to who? He goes, that's one of the things I would think. And I said, well, that's true for all 32 passengers. So who do you think they sent back to Rochester, New York? And who did they send to Long Beach? And who did they send to Berkeley, California? When they sent the remains of the American crew. I shudder to think that parts of the body of Guadalupe Ramirez are somewhere in Rochester to this day, who knows? But that was his response, as he said, we didn't know, we couldn't have, I imagine he said that we wouldn't know who to send where. It was just such a disaster, that nobody was really identifiable, and that's kind of across the board. It's been said in the accident reports and in newspapers that no one was really identifiable. No one was able to be identified. They had all been burned and just smashed and pretty much annihilated. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was their response. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, and I'm glad you asked, why do you think? That's incredibly,
Yeah.
incredibly powerful question there. Miss Tammy has the question. Ask the question, when is the film of your journey coming out? Your book was so amazing and so inspirational. If I were a filmmaker, I would be all over this story.
I appreciate you saying that. You know what? I will share this. Well, right now there's a conversation happening about turning it into a TV series that we haven't, it's gotten a little bit of legs, but obviously, we kind of keep our fingers crossed and see where it goes. For me, the process, there were quite a few production companies that hit me up when the book was released in 2017. And I spoke with many of them, met with a lot of them. And for me, this project has always felt very personal. I feel very much indebted and in close contact with the families. So for me, having a sense of control over how these stories are being told has always been very important to me. And also kind of a promise, an unspoken promise I feel like I've made to the families. Also a spoken promise, to be honest with you, for some of the families. So it was very much, it took a long process for me to even agree to move forward with one of these production companies. But now I feel like there's the right people in place, and we're starting to move forward with that. But again, it's for me, a very careful, fragile process. I want the stories of the passengers to be done well. I feel like that's, it's a very powerful story. It's a story that I think transcends it's organically transcends both sides of the border. It's a very United States American story, and it's also a very Mexicano story. So, we want both sides of that to be represented authentically and done right. So those kinds of things take a lot of time. So we'll see how it comes along. I'll keep you all informed. But you can light your candles, light your candles for us.
Oh, we will. We will.
Yeah.
Tammy and I we'll do that, and I'll subscribe to whatever streaming service it's on. So that's very exciting news.
Yeah,
Um,
it is.
yeah. Alejandra asks another question. Why do you think there are many things that did not match? For example, the official name list and the real name list that you received. And the question Alejandra asks is, do you think the government was trying to hide something?
I think the government was trying to shrug off responsibility. That was, that was made very clearly in some of the statements that they made right after the accident. In fact, one of an official from the U.S. Department of Labor actually said, and I'm paraphrasing, something to the effect of, that none of the responsibility, or you say none of the responsibility rests in the United States government. It was a chartered airplane, and they were kind of shrugging the responsibility towards the airplane company at the time. So that was blatantly said. But I feel like this. What was the second part of that question? I'm sorry.
Do you believe the government was trying to hide something? But I think you answered that. But why do you think the official names list, the information you were given?
That's right. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of inconsistencies. I mean, for one, in some situations, the workers themselves who were coming across as part of the Bracero program were telling the names to whoever was the typist behind and so some of the names were very much botched. Apolonio Plasencia was Apolloni Placenti. There were names like Negroros Alvarez, and there was no such name as Negroros, but there was a Negrete Alvarez. So I think also they were hearing it phonetically at times, like I said, and kind of just misspelling it in the typing. That's at least one of my guesses. Maybe perhaps Dr. Leyva could even speak more to accuracy to that, some of that. But so, and then of course there's time. There's time is a major factor as well for why we get some information and others not. Memory also is very, I have a hard time remembering things that happened to me 20 years ago, and I still have a great memory. Imagine asking someone questions, memories that happened more than 70 years ago. That's very difficult. So it's very sort of blotchy, some of the memory of it. So a lot of this history, at the end of the day, what's happened, a lot of the history is fading fast. The history is deteriorating fast. So I know that myself and my colleagues and other folks out there are trying to gather these stories as much as we can as well. So yeah.
Yeah, you make an excellent point, and I think we should ask Dr. Leyva to corroborate how names are anglicized, how they were spelled phonetically, and not a lot of attention was played to detail, and errors were made. So thank you so much for stating that, reminding us of it. You said art is gravity, right? And so that I got to tell you, it's sticking in my head. Is there, other than this project, is there any other projects or that have drawn your attention or passions that you hope will bring you
there?
bring attention?
It's kind of funny because I always get sort of corralled into the conversation about the Bracero program, but that was never originally my intention. My intention wasn't to learn more about the Bracero program, and nor am I a Bracero scholar. With respect to those who really have done that work for years around that program and that history. For me, it was more. I come at this by way of the humanities. I used to work for the National Endowment for the Humanities, gathering stories, and so for me, it was like I saw this. For me, it just came down to I felt very much like there was this injustice that folks died without their names, and I wanted to know who they were. And then it was like, okay, after we get their names, who are they? What are their stories? That was my interest. My loyalty was to their stories, not to their political situation or to the job they were in. It was just, how do I gather their stories? I want to know who they were. How did they love? How did they live? What were their dreams and hopes? That was my concern, and my loyalty was to gathering that information. And it just happened to be that peripherally, as I would gather that information, I ended up learning about the Bracero program more than I ever thought I would learn. I learned a lot about airplanes also, you know what I mean? I know more about airplanes than I've ever wanted to know. So there's things like that. There are these kind of peripheral subjects that I've learned about along the way, but it's always been about gathering the stories, and it still is. So for me, when I'm thinking of projects in the future, well, first of all, like I said, I'm finishing part 2 to this book about the new families, and it's a little different actually than this book as well in many ways. But beyond that, I feel like I think my job is always to kind of just stay open to stories. I don't necessarily go looking for stories, but I just kind of keep myself open and aware, paying attention to my community and surroundings. And when a good story comes along, hopefully I'm aware enough to jump on that. Yeah. You're on. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Ha! We had to have one. It was going to be me. Um, Tawanda would like to share that it was good because it gives us history and foundation for our cultures, for our backgrounds, um, and the storytelling that you've shared with us. It really, I have to tell you, the reason I use it so much is I use it in my lectures when I talk about civil rights protest songs. Bring it,
Yes.
we go from, Strange Fruit, Mississippi, Goddamn, Black and Blue, Louis Armstrong, and then I bring it and I locally, right? And we localize the stories, and I have your amazing book to refer to, and
Yeah.
the wonderful video by Lance Canales and the flood with your voice and the presente at the end. Oh, gets me every time. Um,
Yes. Yes.
so
Let me share one anecdote that I can end this on, if I can. It's just take a couple minutes. But finally, in 2018, the California Senate recognized the accident formally there in Sacramento at the state capitol. They brought myself, my family. I had my two children with me, myself and my parents, but also then the families for four of the passengers were all there with the photographs of their relatives. You can find this video online if you haven't seen it yet. Just look up California State Senate and then my name, and you'll find the video. But what was beautiful is, so in that moment, they recited, actually, the folk singer Joan Baez was there as well with us because she had sang the song. And so we're there in the State Senate. And as they're reciting my children have been with me since, they've been a part of this since they were pretty much little. They've been seeing this. So at presentations, whenever I read the names out loud, I have the audience shout back presente, presente after every name, right? Just obviously invocation of they are present with us. Their spirits are here. So my son and my children have been around that forever. They know that. Anyway, here we are at the State Senate in Sacramento, and we're, it's all very formal, and the Senator William Monting is reading the names out loud to the entire all the politicians who are there standing up. And actually, though, they begin sitting down at first, and then he starts to read the names. And as he's reading the names, you can see in the video my son, who's like 5, I don't know, he's like 6 or something like around the time, he starts to whisper like presente. My son starts to whisper that, right? And the senator hears him and looks back at him and tells him like louder. So all of a sudden you hear all the crowd start to slowly start to say presente, presente, and starts to grow louder and louder after every name there in the state senate. It was beautiful. And pretty soon we were looking out and we're seeing politicians saying back presente, presente. It was a very powerful moment. You can see that video online, but it was just the families were in tears. We were just emotional, and it's just a very, very nice way to at least get some recognition, a formal recognition by the state. And it's a beautiful thing what they say. Their statement that they make is very beautiful, on behalf of all the passengers who were there, all the Mexicanos who went there, part of the program, the Bracero program, to work. Yeah.
thank you for that beautiful story.
Sure.
Oscar has posted that link for us. I'll go turn the camera off and watch it and cry a little bit more.
Thank you,
Um,
Oscar.
Tammy said you've resurrected them by finding and sharing their stories. Thank you. Okay. What was the response of the families you found along the way? Did they feel heard once again? That's our last question, and then we'll let you wrap up.
Yes, the response of the families is always, after I worked with them for at least 2 or 3 years, at least that long, some of them 6 years still going on. We still have informal interviews and conversations. The families have all expressed gratitude because of the closure. It's closed a chapter for their entire family that generations have kept with them. We inherit some of our family's griefs and traumas. We inherit these things oftentimes. And many conversations I've had with family members who didn't even know the passenger. They just knew them by stories. And the moment I would talk about them and bring them information, they would cry. It was like a release for their families for generations, a release. And I just feel very humbled. And I don't know why. I don't know why I was called to do this work, but I feel very humbled by it every time, and I'm learning so much from it. That's what I hope to, at least, that's the message I hope to give back through the next book, is how much I've learned, how much I've received from this work. Yeah.
Well, thank you for this amazing session. I'm so thrilled that we were able to share it with our students, and that you're continuing to share the story of these Bracero workers. We'd love to have you come back and speak about your next edition.
I would love.
Yeah, good. So expect that invitation. Thank you so much, and we'll and We'll have open up mics if you want to open up your mic and give a round of applause or put something. There we go. We got a round of applause. Woo! That's exciting. So thank you very much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you as well. I appreciate you all. Take care.
Bye.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
My name is Jorge Rodriguez. I am a part of the history faculty at Valverde. I have the great honor of introducing our next two speakers. So Dr. Yolanda Chavez Leiva is a Chicana fronteriza historian and writer who was born and raised on the border. She is of, and Dr. Leiva, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Raramuri descent, and honors her grandmother, Canuta Roacho. She's the director of the Institute of Oral History and associate professor in the Department of History at UTEP. She's also the lead historian of the first ever Bracero Museum, funded by the Mellon Foundation, slated to open in Socorro, Texas in 2024. She has spent her life listening to and now documenting the lives of people who live on La Frontera. Professor Leiva specializes in border history, public history, and Chicana history as well. She is also the co-founder of Museo Urbano, a museum of the streets that highlights fronterizo history by taking it where people are, from museums to the actual streets of El Paso. She came to academia after a decade of social work in the Black and Brown communities of East Austin, with a desire to make academia and especially history relevant and useful to people. She's a recipient of the National Council on Public History Best Public History Project Award and the American Historical Association Herbert Face. I apologize if I mispronounced it. The Herbert Face Award that recognizes distinguished contributions to public history. She has curated and co-curated many museums exhibits with her students. One of the other reasons I'm honored to introduce her is because she served on my master's panel when I was working on my master's degree. So glad to see you again, Dr. Leiva. The next person I'll also be introducing is Kimberly Sumano Ortega. She is a doctoral candidate in Borderlands history at the University of Texas at El Paso. With a background in anthropology, she is currently interested in colonial and modern history of movement, perception, and body, particularly in the borderland region. Her research focuses on both space and discourse analysis at the intersection of archaeological and historical fields. She has published academic articles related to the contact period in central Mexico, rock art from Michoacan, and spatial analysis in Jalisco and Durango. She's currently working on analyzing indigenous and Spanish perceptions through phenomenological lens of the Camino Real del Tierra Adentro, a space descriptively created during the 16th and 17th centuries and experienced in many ways in daily basis from colonial times to the present. Kimberly has been the curator and co-curator of several archaeological, historical, and art exhibits, including Encaged Hearts, a Central American child migration and detention in the United States, presented at the Centennial Museum and the Chihuahuan Gardens at the University of Texas at El Paso. As a research assistant at the Institute of Oral History, she nowadays parts of the Seeking Refuge Oral History Project that documents the experience of migrants trying to enter the United States. The Bracero program, The Legacy, is an ongoing oral history project that documents the experience of former Braceros and their families. As a Mellon Fellow, she is a part of the team working at the Rio Vista Museum in Socorro, Texas. So Dr. Leiva and Kimberly Sumano Ortega, I leave the floor to you. It is all yours.
Hi, everybody. I'm trying to get organized. Everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Thank you so
Yes.
much. First, I want to thank the EPCC Pasos team for inviting us to join in this collaboration. It is a very exciting event for us to share the stories of Braceros and to work with our colleagues at EPCC. It's been a real pleasure. I want to dedicate my part of the presentation to my friend Donna Snyder, who is a wonderful, well-known poet who's getting ready to leave this world any time now. And as an attorney, she defended agricultural workers. So I want to think about her as we're talking about the lives of braceros. I titled this The Work of a Bracero is Never Done because I found that quote in a 1950s newspaper. And having both interviewed many braceros and also read many bracero oral histories, I know that that's true. 80 years ago, this month, the first braceros entered the United States through the El Paso port of entry, and they were quickly whisked away to work in the beet fields outside of Texas because the Mexican government didn't want braceros in Texas because of our state's long history of anti-Mexican violence. So 80 years ago, they came to El Paso and very quickly left. When the Bracero program first began in 1942 as a result of agricultural employers saying that there was a labor shortage because of men entering the military, there was a lot of propaganda in welcoming them to the United States, and in fact, early on they were called soldiers of the fields. World War II was a time when the United States and Mexico were allies to each other, and as you can see from this poster, with both representing Mexico and the United States, it said, Americans all, let's fight for victory. So the Bracero program begins in that context of one, employers saying there's not enough workers, and Mexico wanting to be an ally and seeing many benefits to the Bracero program for both Mexican workers and for Mexico as a whole. The Bracero program was a great example of this contradiction that the United States has always had when it comes to the issue of Mexican labor. It's always been, we love you, come work here, we hate you, get out of here. And you can see it over and over, decade after decade, and the Bracero program embodies these contradictions, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But in 1942, the United States was telling Mexican laborers, men specifically, young men specifically, we love you, we need you, come work for us. The Bracero program that starts in 1942 had a precedent. There was a similar program during World War I. In 1917, we had the temporary admissions program. 1917 is a really interesting year because there was an immigration act passed that year that was really geared towards keeping out poor Europeans. And the way to keep out poor people was, one, to impose a head tax of $8 per adult. And if you're thinking about people who might be making the equivalent of 25 cents a day, how are they ever going to save up $8? And the second part of that Immigration Act was a literacy test. So it's intended to keep out poor people, especially Europeans, but it also has the effect of keeping out poor Mexicans. But again, as in World War II, agricultural employers say, no, we need laborers in our fields because of the men who've gone off to war. So the US created the temporary admissions program, which allowed Mexican men to come on a temporary basis to work in the fields. So again, it's the we love you, come work here. In 1954, in the midst of the Bracero program, the federal government instituted what they called Operation Wetback. And it was geared towards deporting migrants who were here without papers. One of the things that the Bracero program did during its existence of 1942 to 1964 is it taught Mexican men where to work, how to find jobs, how to get to jobs, and how to live in the United States. So men came both through the system of the Bracero program, but also outside of the system of the Bracero program. So you have an increase in undocumented migration to the United States at the same time that you have the Bracero program. So 1954 and Operation Wetback is an example of the we hate you, go back where you came from. Today we still have a temporary worker program through the H-2A visa. The H-2A visa is a special visa that agricultural employers can apply for in order to bring temporary workers. And they have to prove that there's a labor shortage, they have to agree to a certain pay rate, to provide housing for free. In many ways, it tries to do a better job than the Bracero program did as far as providing good conditions for workers. But again, it's the we love you, come work for us. We hate you, don't be here. Let's talk about the Bracero program a little bit. As I said, and it's going to be next week, September 27th. 80 years ago, the first Braceros entered through El Paso. It's not till 1947 that the Mexican government agrees to allow Braceros to work in Texas. They were working everywhere other than Texas. They were working not only in agriculture, also in railroads and in other industries. During that period of time when they weren't allowed in Texas, agricultural employers were not complaining. To the contrary, they were very clearly saying, we're fine without Braceros because we're on the border and we can just recruit men without papers. But nevertheless, 1947, Braceros began to work in Texas, and we have Braceros here in El Paso, in the lower valley in particular, and also in the Mesilla Valley just up the road. In 1948, there is something that comes to be known as the El Paso incident. And the El Paso incident shows how much power agricultural employers had. So the way that the Bracero program worked is that men would receive a contract of 6 months to come work in the United States. And then they would have to go back on Mexican soil for a month before they could reapply to come back. In 1948, during cotton picking time, and if you know anything about the history of El Paso, you know that El Paso was a big, important producer of cotton. And if you know about cotton, you know that if cotton is not harvested quickly, it rots in the fields. So 1948 cotton picking season, there's a breakdown in negotiations between the United States and Mexico over renewing the Bracero program. And there is no Bracero program at a time that is so important to agricultural employers here in El Paso. So employers talked with the immigration, they talked with the Border Patrol, and told them how desperate they were for workers. Meanwhile, on the Juarez side of the river, thousands of men were gathered waiting for the Bracero program to be renewed, and they were very desperate. They were in Juarez with no jobs, no money, no resources. So the Border Patrol agreed to turn a blind eye while literally thousands of men crossed the river to pick cotton here. And this is not the only time it happened. Sometimes the Border Patrol would allow men to cross the river, then they would detain them, then they would parole them to agricultural employers. So employers have so much power in this process of recruiting braceros, of having the federal government even agree to a bracero program. During the course of its life, again 1942 to 1964, there were about 5 million contracts given out to about 2 million men. Some men came just one time. We did an oral history with a former bracero who came, and in those months that he was here in the United States, his little daughter died. And he just, even when we interviewed him and was in his 80s, he still had tears in his eyes thinking about how his little daughter had died and he wasn't there. So he said, I'm never coming back again to be a bracero. I'm going to stay with my family. Other men came year after year after year. So that's the discrepancy between the 2 million men and the 5 million contracts. The Bracero program was beloved by employers, and so many men were coming through the El Paso port of entry, and they were being processed at the Coliseum. They were being processed at Fort Bliss. But in 1951, the federal government set up an actual processing center for the men at Rio Vista Farm, which is in Socorro. And some of you might be from the Lower Valley. I know we also have people here from San Antonio today, but some of you who are from El Paso might be from the Lower Valley. Rio Vista Farm has a fascinating history, being a poor farm, a center for abandoned children, a CCC camp, and then in 19, when it becomes the Bracero Processing Center. Again, in the 1950s, I already talked about Operation Wetback. In 1956, a very important book was published, Strangers in Our Fields, documenting the experiences of braceros, and it was written by Dr. Ernesto Galarza, who was a PhD scholar and a labor organizer. And this is one of the first books that we have written about braceros. The program ends in 1964 under a lot of pressure from unions in the United States who feel, one, that the Bracero program is exploiting men, and men were exploited, and I'll talk about that in a second. And labor unions are also saying, including the United Farm Workers, the unions are also saying that they are lowering the wages that could be paid to U.S. farm workers. So it ends in 1964. For a program that was started with the idea that the U.S. needed labor because of wartime shortages, you see that it goes way past World War II, it goes past the Korean conflict. So we know that even though employers were saying, oh, we need workers because of the war, that it was really the desire of employers to have a controlled way to bring in labor that they could exploit. The Bracero program transformed the lives of families. It transformed the lives of the men who came here. There's a documentary photographer named Leonard Nadel, and this is one of his photographs. In the mid-1950s, he was contracted by Time magazine to document the Bracero program and the families of Braceros in Mexico. And the Smithsonian has thousands of his photos, and this is a photo of a Bracero family in Mexico. Well, how did it transform the families? When the men came to the United States for those periods of 6 months, and when they came over and over again for years, they left their wives and families really to fend for themselves. Their dream was to save money from the Bracero program that then they could help their families back in Mexico with, that they could take back to Mexico and perhaps buy land and buy what they needed to be farmers. What very often happened, though, is that the men didn't really get that much money. I saw a paycheck once that was for 2 cents. So once the employers charged them for lodging, charged them for food, they had very little money left. On the other hand, we've interviewed men who were able to build a home for their elderly parents and were extremely proud of that, or who could build a home for their wives and children, who were extremely proud of that. Meanwhile, the women left back in the villages had to find ways to support their families at a time when in many of the small traditional villages, women weren't supposed to go out and be working in public. So it changed women's lives very dramatically, and it changed the lives of their children. The children who grew up knowing that their father was in the United States somewhere, but rarely seeing him. A few years ago, I spoke to the daughter of Bracero, and what she remembers about her childhood is that her father would come back to their home every December for Christmas and would bring her a doll from the United States, and she loved those dolls that he brought from the United States. But she only saw him once a year. So it transforms the lives of families. It transforms the lives of men. We don't really know how many men returned to the United States, but we know that many men came back to the United States, became residents, became citizens, and raised their families here in the United States. And we've interviewed men who have tears in their eyes talking about how this country gave them the opportunity to raise their family where their children could have a good education and could have good jobs. We also have oral histories in our collection where men talk about how they returned to Mexico with broken bodies, who couldn't do manual labor anymore because the labor in the United States was so difficult. At the end of the presentation, we're going to show you a 2-minute video about one of the agricultural implements that the men were forced to use that was part of this breaking of their bodies. The men who came to be part of the Bracero program suffered during that process, and they suffered on both sides of the border. They had to be processed in Mexico, and then they had to be processed in the United States. So we have oral histories of men that talk about going to the processing center in Mexico. And again, we're talking about men with very few resources. So they show up at the processing center in Mexico. They might have to wait 1 or 2 weeks before they're processed and sent to the United States. They're living on the streets meanwhile. They talk about eating newspaper to fill their stomachs so that they don't feel the hunger so much. They talk about waiting in lines of hundreds of men, waiting to hear their name called. If for some reason they don't hear their name called, they go to the back of the line again. So the men suffer in Mexico trying to get to the United States, and then they suffer here even during the processing period. They suffer as well. And I'm going to give you a very heartbreaking example of the suffering of the men when they came to the U.S. Reception Center, like Rio Vista. When the men were being processed as braceros, they were sprayed with DDT to fumigate them. And they didn't know they were being sprayed with a poison. And you can see in this photo, again by Leonard Nadel, how they're being sprayed directly in the face, but they were also sprayed in their genitals. And all the men that I have interviewed talk about el polvo blanco, the white powder, and how humiliating it was to be stripped naked, sprayed everywhere with this white powder, and not even know what's happening. Sometimes they say, we're not dirty. Why are they doing that to us? Men's hands were checked to make sure that they were actually agricultural workers. Their hands had to be calloused, they had to be rough in order to prove that they could be a bracero. I interviewed one former bracero who said, my hands were always like baby skin, no matter how hard I worked. My hands were smooth and soft, and he talked about how he was so worried the night before he was going to be processed that he spent the whole night rubbing his hands on a rusty pipe, trying to roughen them up so he would look like he could be a bracero. Men were transported often in cattle cars where they didn't have a place to sit, where they had to just figure out how to take care of their bodily needs. And they were inspected very much in the way that people inspect livestock. So it's a very humiliating process on both sides of the border. One very little told story is the way in which the program also changed the lives of Mexican Americans. In this photo, you see the row of men standing in line and the row of clerks sitting at the typewriters. Because the men spoke Spanish, the government looked for women who could type and who could speak Spanish. So here locally, they went to the high schools and they sought out high school girls who were bilingual and who could type, and they hired them to be clerks. And we interviewed one woman who began as a high school, in between her junior and senior year, began working for the Bracero program at Rio Vista. She worked there in 1952. And when she graduated from high school, continued her government job, and she worked for the civil service for the rest of her life, and she traveled all over the world. So young women were given opportunities because of their bilingual skills and because of their clerical skills to work for the government, which was not really very common in the 1950s for Mexican Americans. And they, when we interviewed the women who worked at Rio Vista, they told us that they were told, don't look at the men in the eyes, because the government wanted to protect the women, so don't look at them in the eyes. But they said sometimes they did look at the very handsome ones. She told me they looked at the handsome ones. And one of the questions they had to ask was, do you have any scars or physical markings in case anything happens and we need to identify your body? And she talked about men opening their shirts and showing scars or showing tattoos, and how embarrassing it was for her as a 17-year-old to be looking at a man's body. So young Mexican American women had these opportunities that they had not had before in working for the government in the processing centers. The Bracero program was a program that we can think of in terms of exploitation. Workers were exploited. They were underpaid. They were put to work in very terrible conditions. In the oral histories, they talk about the housing being either very cold in the winter or very hot in the summer. One man talked about how he just slept outside because it was so hot inside of the barracks. But it was also a place of hope. The men were willing to go through this suffering because they had hope for a better life. They wanted a better life for themselves, but as importantly, in the stories that they tell, they wanted a better life for their parents, for their siblings, for their wives and their children. And they often talk about how they were willing to suffer for their families. I'm going to turn the session over to Kimberly Sumano Ortega right now, who's going to talk about Rio Vista Farm and the first and only Bracero Museum in the United States. Kimberly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I am very happy to be here and to share with you one of the current projects that we have at the Institute of Oral History. And Dr. Leiva has given us a pretty close look to the Bracero program and its relevance to the U.S. history. By studying the history of the Braceros, and depending on how we see it, we can build the connections to the history of labor, political history, history of migration, history of agriculture, Mexican American history, Latinx history, and Chicanx history. She did a great job in making the point on how important and impactful to the present the history of the Bracero program is. But how and why is this relevant for us here in the El Paso del Norte region? And I would like to invite you guys to explore this piece of history with me through one place, one specific place, which is the Rio Vista farm. So where is Rio Vista? Rio Vista Farm is located in the county of Socorro, Texas, barely 15 miles southeast from El Paso, Texas. As you can see, it is pretty close to Ciudad Juarez, and it's also pretty close to El Paso. And this is important because Braceros would first arrive to Ciudad Juarez and then cross the border through El Paso, and then they were taken to Socorro. In the past, Socorro was perceived as a periphery, considering El Paso a node, but the map really shows how close Socorro and El Paso are, and how with Ciudad Juarez, they all become part of the El Paso del Norte region. So Rio Vista here is a place that has been functioning for over 1 century. It opened in 1915 as a poor farm, and then it received poor children. During the Great Depression, it was a New Deal center. By the time of World War II, it was a camp for war prisoners. And then specifically in 1951, it became a reception center during the Bracero program. As we can see, the history of this place is closely linked to poverty, humiliation, policing, and segregation. But nowadays, it works as a community center that serves mainly our abuelitos and abuelitas from Socorro. In the context of the Bracero program that started in 1942 to bring Mexican workers to the American fields to feed the country under war pressure, Rio Vista opened its doors in 1951 as a reception center. From then and to the time of the end of the program in 1964, over 800,000 contracts were processed here. It is to say, for the Braceros to be that crossing these points like Rio Vista, the processing centers, was very, very critical. It was one of the main points of the journey of becoming a Bracero, actually. Rio Vista and the other 4 reception centers are along the U.S.-Mexico border were the last filter, if we want to call it that way, before letting the Braceros into the country. Let's remember that the ID that certified temporary workers was issued issued after a medical, physical, and even we could call it a moral examination of these men. And they could not leave Rio Vista until they had signed a contract with a farmer. If any of the above mentioned steps failed, Mexican men would have to begin their way back for being rejected as workers in the U.S. In other words, Rio Vista was the place where the American dream would become a reality, or would, as any other dream, simply disappear. And that speaks directly to the historical relevance of Rio Vista, because it is the only former reception center in the United States that's still standing. And therefore, there is no better place to talk about the history of the Bracero program and the Bracero experience than turning this site into a museum of Braceros for our people, for our community. How to make a Bracero museum? Well, due to the relevance of the place and its nomination as a National Historic Landmark Site, the City of Socorro Community Initiative and the wonderful team led by Adriana Rodarte, Victor Reta, and Alejandra Valadez were able to achieve a huge goal in 2021, namely a grant from the Mellon Foundation to make this wonderful and historically meaningful place into a museum specialized in Bracero history. From then on, in partnership with the Institute of Oral History at UTEP, we are all working to create a space that includes relevant information that scholars have already put out there through their books and articles, but also we want to be a little bit more inclusive. And we want to devote some space to the narratives that circulate around the Bracero program, but are not necessarily conceived as central to its history. To us, this other history or these other stories are very important too. So how do we do this? How do we turn this place into a museum? First of all, let me show you the place. We have seen some pictures of Rio Vista throughout this presentation, but let me now offer you a bird's eye view. This is the segment on the site where we want to focus our efforts, because over 21 of these buildings are relevant to the Bracero stage of Rio Vista. We plan to do this through public history, which is the use of historical skills and methods outside the traditional academic realm. Public historians use their training to meet the needs of a community, whether that community is defined as a city, as a neighborhood, or a region. In our case, it is important to recognize that the history that we are sharing with the community is based on a site, but it has binational and transnational implications, due to the nature, of course, of the Bracero program. So it's a very, very complex and very rich history. Public history is also a collaborative work. We historians work together with architects, artists, designers, administrators, and so on. Each part has to do its job. And as the history team, we suggested to include 2 buildings here. We were assigned this building. Let me show you this building right here, building 17, to develop the exhibit. And then we suggested that we should include also building 18, which is this one, the Quonset hut. And it used to be where the braceros were fumigated. And then this other building right here, the very small one, which is built building 26. And this was a restroom, and it was built in the late stage of the reception center. So minutes ago, I mentioned several approaches that we could possibly consider to share the bracero history with our community and with the general audiences. But we have chosen to develop a narrative focused on the lived experience of those who are part of the bracereada in a wide sense. When listening to the oral histories done to braceros, it is common that they describe the lack of intimacy, and that many times they felt humiliated by the scrutiny they had to go through. So leaving these 2 buildings, for us, very, very symbolic artifacts that were already inside, was a main part of our interpretation, or the interpretation that we wanna share with the community. Otherwise, it would have been like mutilating part of the history, a big portion of the experience that braceros had at Rio Vista. That being said, it is very important that people visiting the museum take away with them the understanding of a very human, or maybe we should say, in fact, dehumanizing process. Because the experience of the braceros as human beings is our center, we're looking forward to share a little piece of history in situ, where the body of the visitor becomes fundamental for building connections. I cannot imagine trying to share a space like a shared restroom with no intimacy, with potentially maybe 20 other people at the same time. This is the Quonset hut. This is from a view from the outside. This is the inside. Dr. Leiva here, and Ligia Arguiles, another member of our team right here. This is the restroom. This is part of the inside, and showers and the toilets and everything without any separation, without any walls. So bracero history also has multiple layers. And let me show you right here. This is what building 17 is going to look like. Remember, I showed you building 17. So one of these layers is the geographical one. And we really want to see these geographies represented in the distribution of the rooms within building 17. So bracero history is really a binational history. It involves parts of the process taking place within 2 nations, both Mexico and the United States. So the main topic is the bracero program, right? So this will be speaking only about the bracero program. And then this area is going to be the Mexican room. We want to share how the process of becoming a bracero started in Mexico. And then this is going to be the transportation room, how men were able to get to Ciudad Juarez, for example, in this case, and then cross the border, right? So it's obviously a transnational history. Since people were crossing the border back and forth to build a cultural and an economic bridge that unified a shared life and a shared history. And once again, it is here, right in the middle of the connection, where Rio Vista becomes the site. And it's right here, right in the middle of the building, where Rio Vista's narrative takes place. It is clear that the national Mexican context is what pushed braceros and many times their families to cross the border to pursue the American dream, quote unquote. And what they experimented in assimilating a different culture impacted their hometowns back in Mexico. At the same time, they brought with them energy to farm the land and to pick what the land had to give. They brought their dreams, their humor, and their cheerfulness that characterizes us Latinos to help the country keep on going in the context of World War II and even a little further. So this U.S. history will be shown right here and here. Moreover, the Braceros built a life based on constant movement, crossing the border once and again. They built families, sometimes in Mexico, sometimes in the US, and some other times even in both countries at the same time, I must say. They had kids, and then they had their own kids who grew up listening to the stories that their grandpas had to tell about how hard the bracereada was, how much they suffered, as Dr. Leiva was explaining. But also, they had grandmas that shared stories of taking, having to take care of the family businesses, or working the land back in Mexico, or raising the kids on their own, by themselves, and waiting for their loves to come back. And many of these times, they were not asked about any decision that the men took, and they were not even, they didn't have the opportunity to complain, or they weren't asked how they felt, etc. So these women were as young as the men working on the fields. And this is one of our main contributions here. We have a commitment to visibilize the Bracero legacy. And right here, this one will be the Bracero legacy room. The legacy room deserves a very special treatment here. Math doesn't lie, and we are here to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Bracero program. So that means that the former Braceros that are still with us are somewhere around their late 80s, their 90s. And that has taken the Institute of Oral History to focus the efforts in recording the oral histories that these men, our abuelos, have and want to share with us. But recognizing other historical actors and giving agency to women and children as part of the Bracero history made us realize that there are many historiographical blanks in this regards. Since we notice that, we are trying to fill the blanks through oral histories that connect that past with the present. So we created the Bracero program, the Legacy Project. This project seeks to gather all the possible information by interviewing former Braceros and their families in both sides of the border. That has allowed us to identify what we usually call a shared history, as I just did actually. And it really, this history, this shared quote unquote history, I must say, really develops in a very different direction depending on what side of the river the family stayed. For those who made their way to the U.S., citizenship is the completion of the American dream. It is a collective dream. This is one of the branches that nurtures a Latinx, Mexican American, and Chicanx identity. For those that remained in the south side of the Rio Bravo, it is more like a hard stage of the lives of the former Braceros, but it doesn't really have a deep life-changing impact. And I guess even less, it impacts less even their descendants. So it is to say that this is an ongoing project. If you have any story that you'd like to share with us, please don't hesitate, contact us and be part of this project. Let me share with you the story of these people that you're seeing here. This is Javier right here. This is the Institute of Oral History team. And Javier is the grandson of a bracero right here. He feels incredibly proud of his grandpa and the labor and the that grandpa did for them to be on this side of the border and to have lots of opportunities, go to school, just better their lives, right? He's actually right now he's working at the History Museum here in El Paso, and that there is where Ligia Arguiles met him. So she asked Javier if he wanted to be part of the project, and then he agreed, of course, and he brought in his grandpa, but he also brought in his grandma, the wife of the bracero. And then we're still missing right now to interview Javier's mom, but I can tell you that it's beautiful to see how this experience of being a bracero has passed from one generation to the other generation, and this is how history is built, based on memories and based on experiences. We have also done several interviews, several oral histories on the south side of the border, and this is practically what we expect to show in the legacy room. This is how the Socorro team imagined that Rio Vista will look in 2024. We shared with you our expectations on what the museum will look like. We've shared with you part of the Bracero history, and as historians, we are committed to conceive a more inclusive, broad, complex, and rich history of the Bracero program, focusing on the Braceros' experience and their legacy. We're sure that there is no better way to honor these men and women who made the existence of this piece of history possible now, 80 years after, than building this museum and sharing it with our community, and even more, you know. So to me, this image looks like a place where past and present meet, and I hope you guys can visit it once we open it. Thank you so much.
We'd like to end our part of the program by showing you a 2-minute video. We've been working in collaboration with the City of Socorro Community Initiative, which is part of creating the museum, in producing small videos about the Bracero program. And you're going to be the first people to see this short video, so you are the debut audience. So we'll show this and then we'll come back for questions. In 1956, documentary photographer Leonard Nadel took a photo of a bracero with a short-handled hoe, or cortito, resting on his shoulder. The young man stares directly into the camera with a sense of confidence, his sombrero tipped back on his head. What this photo makes invisible is the inhumane working conditions created by employers who insisted agriculture workers use the short-handled hoe. Employers argued that this hoe was better for delicate crops like sugar beets and strawberries. The handle was typically about 12 inches long, forcing the workers to bend at the waist and work hours in this painful position. Working long days, workers endured back-breaking pain using the cortito. In 1975, as a result of a campaign by the United Farm Workers and others, Congress outlawed its use. Sadly, this law came too late for braceros, who worked with the short-handled hoe throughout the duration of the Bracero program. Today, we can look back at this simple farm tool as a symbol of injustice and inhumane working conditions for agricultural workers. For more information, go to When a Garden Tool is the Means of Oppression at the link here.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Leva and Kim, for this amazing presentation. I mean, we can only imagine everything these braceros have gone through. One of the questions we have in the chat is by Elizabeth, and it's, were bracero workers aware of the payment and work conditions they were going for, and did they have a work contract?
That is a great question, Elizabeth. Thank you. So there were contracts, and that's what you saw the young clerks typing out. And the contracts I've seen are about 2 pages, single space, lots of information. but very often braceros couldn't read. So sometimes you even find contracts where they are unable to sign their names, so they sign with their thumbprint. And they're going, through processing quickly. And in Rio Vista, they were processing 2,000 men per day. So no one was sitting and explaining the contract to them. The men were just, yes, I want to be a bracero. Sign me up. So for the first time braceros, they really didn't know what it would be like. And you can see it in some of the photos of their ID cards where they look scared. They don't know what's going to happen. Once they started to come over and over again, they became acquainted with what the system was like. But initially, they didn't know. And they also didn't know, even if they came many times, what each employer would be like. Some employers were very exploitative. Other employers grew very attached to some of the particular men and wrote letters, glowing letters saying, I would gladly hire him again. Please give him another contract. And I've talked to former braceros whose employers actually helped them fix their residency papers.
If anyone else has any more questions, by all means, you can either unmute your mic or place them in the chat. I have one question. I guess either Kim or Dr. Leva can answer. And I think you had mentioned earlier that some of the braceros were living on the property of the ranchers or landowners. Would these braceros, were there occasions when they would try to get their own housing?
Because they were only contracted for a place for 6 months at most, I don't think I've ever heard of any bracero looking for housing separately from the employer. It could have happened, I'm not aware of it though. So they lived in often barrack type of housing. And somewhere outside of Las Cruces, there still are some of those barracks. And if you look at the Leonard Nadel photos, and you can Google Leonard Nadel photos, and you will see photos of the dormitories where they lived. One of the big deals when they lived in the dormitories was to have a radio, because right, Kimberly, we found that radios were a big deal. It represented modernity. It's something they could take back home to Mexico, and it was a source of connection to Mexican music, to their culture, a source of entertainment.
But also, I think that braceros didn't really have a life out of the farm. So they would stay there all the time. They would just wake up early, prepare their lunch, their meal, their breakfast or whatever, and then they would go out and work 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, and then come back. So the closest, the better.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for answering that question.
Jorge, I
yes.
think Elizabeth had posted something earlier in the chat. She's asking were the bracero workers aware of the payment and work conditions.
I already asked them that question.
Oh, sorry. Okay, well, she's got it in the chat. Yeah. How this injustice of bad work conditions?
So Elizabeth's question of who stood up for them is a fantastic question. Very few people stood up for them. They certainly stood up for themselves when they could. But the Mexican consulate often told the workers, to the farmers, don't act up, don't complain. We just want all of this to run smoothly. So very often the men had to stand up for themselves if they could. There's experiences of groups of men organizing in indigenous languages in Nahuatl so that the Mexican consul wouldn't know that they were organizing for better working conditions. Who did stand up for them were labor organizers like Ernesto Galarza that I talked about earlier, who wrote that book, Strangers in the Field. But for the most part, I would say nobody was standing up for them.
We have another question from Caleb Jimenez, and the question is, does bracero translate to anything in English?
So the word bracero is very connected to this temporary worker program, but it was actually used even before the 1940s to mean a man who came to the United States to work in agriculture, and it comes from the word brazo, arms, because they were working with their arms. So there's not a great translation, but we could say it's a man who works with his arms. I know that sounds strange, but like manual labor is a man or a woman who work with their hands, right, with their manos. So bracero is arms.
Any other questions? Crystal, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't have any questions. I would actually I do. I'm so sorry. I do have one question because and I hope you will indulge me. Um, there's always, and I see it all the time when I'm working with queer advocates, and there's kind of like a resentment of the younger generations that don't know all the terms, that don't know what we went through, don't know the struggles. And I wonder if you indulge us and kind of you mentioned the term wetback, and I remember hearing that a lot when I was when I was a child, and people would call us wetbacks, right? And I wonder if, and I hate to bring up these slang words, but because they're ugly to me. But I think sometimes like our students don't know what they are. I had students that were also asking me what a fresa was the other day, and like, I hope you don't mind indulging us a little bit.
Not at all. I believe in people knowing what things mean. So, wetback is a very derogatory term coming from the idea that Mexicans coming to the US without papers are getting wet by crossing the river, which, of course, in Arizona and Sonora, there's no river to cross, but it refers to that, and it's a very derogatory term. But the fact that the federal government would have something called Operation Wetback
Yeah.
tells you the lack of respect that Mexicans were given.
Thank you
So
so much.
it's Spanish if you hear mojado, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think it's really important that everybody, hear that word, understand these words, um, because they, sometimes we forget our struggles, we forget our histories, and then here we are repeating things again, and we're finding ourselves as a people not given proper respect. And we saw that today through your presentation, and the horrendous, heartbreaking DDT baths these folks were put in. We people were stripped of their names, as was mentioned in Mr. Hernandez's book, and just in general, it's incredibly important that we keep hearing these stories, remembering where we came from, and learning our lessons so that we remember to fight harder for our rights today. Sorry, I haven't had my video on. I took off my lippy stick. I apologize, like my nana said. Anyway, thank you very much to everyone. If there's a lasting statement you'd like to make, I think we're ready to close up. But was there anything, Kim or Dr. Leva?
I will jump in. I'm sorry. And
Please.
you know what? Sometimes we don't even realize that we have a bracero member within the family. We've noticed by doing oral histories that sometimes that's the first time they're speaking out loud about that experience. While interviewing people that remain in the south side of the river, it has so little impact in their lives, or it had so little impact in their lives, because it was the same thing for them to be working here or there, because there wasn't really much of a difference if they had to go back and stay in Mexico, that they never passed on that information, you know, to the next generations. So if you happen to have anyone, or maybe you can just call grandpa right now or call grandma right now and ask them, hey, by any chance, were you a bracero? Or grandma, were you the wife of a bracero? It would be amazing. And it's, again, this is a call for action, but also contact us. Maybe you guys want to share this with us and with the community, because remember that, or maybe we didn't say this before, but see, Lucia, your uncle was a bracero. But the oral histories that we do at the Institute are open sources. So they become part of the community somehow.
Yeah, and one last thing I would like to say is that we've talked a lot about the suffering of the men and of the families, but I also want to say that part of our work here at the Institute is to document these stories of suffering, but to provide a place for the men to talk about the way they live their lives with dignity. And I think us recognizing the dignity of our abuelas and abuelos is very important to us. We can't just look at the suffering. We can't ignore the suffering, but we have to look at the dignity as well.
That was an excellent point to end on. And we thank you for joining us today for our celebration of the Bracero history. As you said, it's 80 years coming up September 27th. So thank you very much for being here. I hope we can continue to collaborate in the future, because sharing these stories with our students is incredibly important. And we greatly appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.